Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is How Simulation Creates Anxiety, Sex, Lies, and Orchids. Man becomes, as it were, the sex organs of the machine world, as the bee of the plant world, enabling it to fecundate and to evolve ever new forms. The machine world reciprocates man's love by expediting his wishes and desires, namely, in providing him with wealth. Marshall McLuhan. The equipment-free aspect of reality here has become the height of artifice. The sight of immediate reality has become an orchid in the land of technology. Walter Benjamin. Well, hi everybody, and this is the cheeky chappy from the thumbnail. And before anyone gets pedantic, because I'll be talking about later on the hammer orchid, I believe this is called the tongue orchid. But the whole point of today's talk is I'm taking from a guy called Charles Bowden. He uses this extended metaphor throughout one of his books called Blood Orchid. And he uses the notion of the orchid, and there are various types of orchid, obviously, but people may not know there's a whole subgenre of orchids, or subspecies, perhaps I should say, that are what are phrased in biology sexually deceptive. So in this instance, the story here is, and I feel like I should have some Barry White background music, but for certain times of the year, the orchid will attract wasps that think it's a female. So, legs akimbo, this male wasp is about to make sweet love to this orchid. And Bowden uses this as a metaphor for how, in a world of simulation, I don't think he uses the term simulation specifically, but I'm adopting it to talk about simulation. And the idea in which, in the world of advanced technology, screen technology, and increasingly artificial intelligence, we are living, it's a given that we're living in a very simulated world. The question then is, what type of effect does this have on us? And I want to explore how some of the anxiety can be caused by this exterior, I can't say it, making exterior, I was going to try and say exteriorization, but making exterior our nervous system almost. And the best person to do that is Marshall McLuhan, and I'll be using his work as we go along. But this is Charles Bowden, and he was a odd character. I encourage you, there's quite a few interviews he's done on YouTube and stuff that are available. I describe him as a man's man, so he's a heavy drinker, heavy smoker, and his realm of interest is the borderland between Mexico and the US, and it's hard to describe his output. This is just one of, I think he did more than 20 books in total. It's difficult to put him in a genre because whilst he was a reporter, I don't think he liked the phrase journalist. He was a reporter, but he writes books that are stream of consciousness and involve very fragmented narratives, and I think I've come across the description as creative non-fiction, if that's not a paradox. I wouldn't, if you want to get into Bowden, if you look at a few of his videos and you're interested, I maybe wouldn't start with Blood Orchid. So I'm a hypocrite because I have started with it. But I'll be doing more on future on Bowden. But Blood Orchid is not one of his more straightforward. You might want to look at books like Murder City or some other books that deal with the war on drugs and the narco state and these type of issues. I think they're a bit more straightforward. But I was really taken, this notion of Blood Orchid. Bowden uses this extended metaphor of the orchid getting into our blood and having tendrils, and there's basically he uses it as a metaphor to explore the undercurrent of the world we live in, and this notion of simulation, which again he doesn't really talk about simulation, but I think implicit in nearly everything he writes, because he's attracted to the desert and he's attracted to the borderland where there are very few people. He's interested in the relationship between an increasingly decadent and dysfunctional society and the beauty of nature, but also how nature's being encroached upon, water's being poisoned, there's pollution. All of these things are dying out, and increasingly it's more and more difficult to find any authentic reality. So all of these themes are bubbling under the surface of Bowden's work. But I am relating it to simulation, and I'm doing it via the work of Marshall McLuhan, who, yes, he's famous and of his time. He was basically on the cover of Time magazine and Man of the Year, I think he was, and a very famous public intellectual. And yes, he is referred to nowadays, but I don't think as much as he should be. I actually think if you're going to understand the concept of simulation, this idea that we're living in what's commonly referred to through the Matrix films and Jean Baudrillard's work as the desert of the real, I think what I'm trying to do in this video is ally Charles Bowden's interest in the desert and the insights from Marshall McLuhan and how he allows us to understand how we've externalized our nervous system almost. Our brains and nervous system have been put out to the exterior world. And later on, I think we'll come across a quote where he talks about we've almost become turtles or have a tortoise shell inside of us. We've almost reversed. What's inside us is now hard, and all the anxiety is being projected outwards, and it makes for a very uncomfortable relationship to the exterior world. So all of these issues, the concept of why it might make us anxious and the world's full of anxiety because we've lost any sense. There's always been a bit of tension between human culture and the environment, but we seem to have almost lost any sense of any natural relationship or anything that seems natural, and we're living in this simulated desert of the world. And I'm, like I say, exploring the concept of the orchid, because the orchid deceives the randy, horny wasp. I've got to say horny because I think Americans, randy is just a first name in the States. It means horny in the UK. But this idea that it's a beautiful metaphor, the way in which the wasp is deceived by the orchid. And Bowden just runs with that metaphor in quite subtle ways. I think it's really good. So this is, on the front, the thumbnail was the tongue orchid. This is, so for any pedantic botanists out there, this is the hammer orchid, which he's actually describing. And we'll go into, I think this is the the description I came across was the pollination. This is called the warty hammer orchid. Nothing like a sexy name. And the wasp is the finine wasp. And I won't pronounce, I'll put up on screen shortly its Latin name, but I don't think I'll have a go at that. And this is Marshall McLuhan, who was in his peak in the 60s. But I don't think he's ever become not relevant. I think he is underappreciated. And if you're looking for an intro into McLuhan's work, I think the most comprehensive, it's widely available as a paperback, Understanding Media, is, I think, the most substantial statement of all his ideas brought together in one place. But in today's video, I'll be quoting from across his oeuvre, his various books. And I won't be spending a lot of time on Walter Benjamin, but I did use him in the epigraph. And ironically, his epigraph, this notion of the equipment-free aspect of reality, has become the height of artifice. The sight of immediate reality has become an orchid in the land of technology. I think I'm paraphrasing accurately. Bowden and McLuhan, I think, are more pessimistic. And this work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, I'd like to look at in future in detail. And it's a weird essay because it's ambiguous. He's purportedly optimistic and thinks humankind will control our relationship to technologies, or we can control our relationship with technologies of reproduction, the way in which cameras and photography obviously capture reality and are able to keep reproducing images. He saw this as a positive thing that would liberate people. But there's also ambiguities in the essay. He talks about the decline of aura, and he defines aura from memory as a unique point in space and time. And he's making the point that Baudrillard and people then take further, that once you can capture reality in an artificial way, you can replicate it, no longer depending upon the original reality. So digital photographs, digital film can just be replicated endlessly, and then potentially we start to lose contact with any type of original reality. This is the theme of the Matrix films. This is the theme of Jean Baudrillard's work. So in 1935, Benjamin was optimistically addressing these issues. And this is, I think, he's just an odd, I think he's over-lionized sometimes in cultural theory, but he is an interesting writer. And this is his notion. He had this print from the artist Paul Klee, and it's called the Angelus Novus. And this is what he wrote about. He was inspired by this print from Paul Klee. A storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence, the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while a pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. So I think this is a lot more pessimistic than elsewhere in his work. And also, I think it's a great summary in some ways of Bowden's approach. He's quite a nihilistic, pessimistic writer. But I just love this image of the angel being blown backwards through history, just observing one catastrophe after the next. So, in the work Blood Orchid, and I keep referring to the work, but it's really difficult to know. It's not a novel. It is non-fiction, but it has very imaginative features to it. So I'll just keep falling back on the work, but also maybe a creative non-fiction. I think that's quite a good description. And what he does is he has sections every 30 or 40 pages scattered throughout the book with this title, Notes on the Sexual Life of Orchids. So interspersed throughout the whole text are these statements about the sexual life of orchids. I'm just focusing on those, not so much because I'm a pervert, but because I obviously don't have time to go through the whole book. So I wanted to address this metaphor he uses and supplement it with the analysis of Marshall McLuhan. So I'll be interspersing Marshall McLuhan. I'll go through the sexual life of orchids. I'll show you some images, and then I will show you some quotes, and I'll give you some analysis from Marshall McLuhan, which I hope, and let me know in the comments if I fail, I hope will illustrate why this is such a fascinating metaphor. And remember the epigraph from McLuhan at the very beginning of this talk, the idea of we become the sex organs of the technological world, like a bee. So human beings become the pollinators of technology. That's the ultimate theme I'm trying to address, which I would argue is in both Bowden's work and Marshall McLuhan's. So they will do anything to reproduce, and they will use the needs of others, the deep appetites they see in all our faces. They will exploit these things to further their own ends. They will take over our ways of loving. They will seize upon our sense of property. They will ruthlessly read our diaries, our secret thoughts, and then make us slaves to our own obsessions. And it's unclear at this point what he's precisely talking about. This is where he uses the orchid as a metaphor for the type of society we live in, and he's also a raging libertarian anarchist, so he objects. There's one little manifesto he gives at one point where he just objects to any government interference in our lives at all. But I found what I've emboldened here, they will ruthlessly read our diaries, our secret thoughts, and then make us slaves to our own obsessions. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist. So for me, this isn't so much about the government spying on us. This is much more about the notion that we have, in a Marshall McLuhan sense, with digital media, we've externalized our nervous system and our emotionality out into the world. So people who've grown up not knowing any other environment, they don't think twice about emoting and sharing things online. That I think people who grew up before there was such a world, who still understand the difference, are much more loath to do. perhaps no clearer example exists than the tactics. So this is where he makes the link, the tactics between the orchid and what he's accusing the simulated society we live in and its downsides. Then the tactics of the hammer orchid and its scheme to seduce one particular type of wasp of the family Thynidae, or Thynidae. Thynids fall into the trap once they gaze upon the labellum of a hammer orchid. So just to repeat, this isn't the hammer orchid, this is the tongue orchid, but this is the notion of the wasp being seduced. I think most of these orchids, these sexually deceptive orchids, are in Australia, maybe New Zealand from memory, but I'm very ignorant about botanical issues. But this is the one he's talking about. So I just think, is it just me, or is that a really cheeky, horny wasp? I was thinking what to add to the thumbnail, like, do you mind? Ding dong, hello. So I just went with, it's an honest mistake, or it's an easily made mistake. But this is the notion that the orchids deceive the wasps into thinking they are mating material. This is the hammer orchid that was being described. I believe this is a hairy, warty orchid. So perhaps to human beings not so attractive. So female Thynids prosper by parasitizing the larvae. And I've put sick there because I'm pretty sure in the biological texts I looked at, it was scarabid or bade and scarabacid that he's describing. I couldn't find a reference to, so I'm not sure whether he's used a faulty original source or he's just made a mistake. But anyway, so parasitizing the larvae of beetles, and the particular beetles favoured as prey live by being root parasites. So to find them, the females have to dig, and since they spent their time digging, they lost the ability to fly. Indeed, they have lost their wings, a sacrifice which makes it easier for the females to tunnel under the earth. The hammer orchid lives high above them in the trees, but somehow has become conscious of their strange ways. And I'm going to describe to you now a whole evolutionary adaptation, and it is weird. Because these orchids are high above in the trees, and because the female wasps, as is being described, operate on the ground before they're taken away by male wasps, it does beg the question, how did the orchids up in the trees ever find out that they could tempt? The whole process by which they tempt, as I'll explain as we go along, it really is odd how evolution works. And again, I think this is a metaphor Bowden uses for when you live in a technological environment, and Marshall McLuhan is very clear about that. He sees advanced technology as an environment. They create a whole different form of nature in which human beings then exist. So I think the analogy being made by Bowden is, if within nature there are these weird underlying forces of adaptation, the question is, have we created the same weird adaptive forces with our own technologies? And like the wasp, are we similarly in ignorance? And then the additional point I'm making is, if we're in ignorance and we're not fully in control of all these underlying forces that with technology almost mimic the way in which evolution has these weird tendencies, this, I think, contributes to anxiety. This is what makes us. We're living in an environment that isn't natural, and it also isn't fully under human control. So at quite a subliminal level, and I'll explore that later with Marshall McLuhan, at a subliminal level, we feel uprooted, we don't feel anchored, we don't feel like we know what's going on, whether that's conscious or, like I say, lying under the surface. Since the female Thynids cannot fly, they cannot search the forest above them for food. This problem they solve by sucking fluids from the beetles that are their victims. Isn't nature lovely? That leaves the great subject of mating. Most wasps of this type have a culture in which the males are the active parties in mating. I'm keeping stum at this point. Usually a female just plants herself in an easily reached location, nightclub, releases a pheromone and lets time solve her problem. Possibly it is an intoxicating situation. And I should emphasize at this point, Bowden isn't exactly a practicing feminist, and he has been criticized by lots of people for he seems to fetishize Aboriginal and Native Indian women, Hispanic women on the border. He seems to really have a type, and he's been accused of fetishizing them. So I'll just put that out there. Now, this isn't what goes together. This is just a you wouldn't see this in nature. But the point being, this is the female wasp without wings on the left, and it's this picture just shows you how the plant mimics that. So the idea is the male wasp would come down at a certain time of the year when the female has climbed. She's come up from the ground. She's on a stalk at the end of a piece of grass or whatever, and she's waiting to be picked up, literally and metaphorically. And to the right, obviously, is that's what the plant does to imitate what she looks like for the male to come along. Usually the mating process proceeds rather simply. The female sits, releases the pheromone into the air, and business proceeds. For copulation to occur, the male wasp must be triggered by scent, by sight, and by touch. So the pretty and winged male flies a patrol. He stumbles upon the inventing scent drifting through the air and follows it. The female, to make it all so easy, has climbed up a ways off the ground on, say, a grass stem. Now the male approaches. The female begins to move her jaws in expectation. I'd be nervous at this point. The male descends, grabs her with his legs, and off they go, like a military aircraft with a deadly missile slung underneath. She does not fear that she will fall. She fastens her jaws on the male's neck, and there she rides secure. They mate while in flight, a seemingly needless risk that long puzzled scientists. So these are insects who have joined the Mile High Club for no apparent reason, because the female can't fly. So if other insects do that, there's, you could argue there are reasons for it, because they're both of flying ability, but not in this case. Why is this ride necessary? True, there are lots of bees and butterflies and whatnot that fornicate in the air, but this species of wasp could have accomplished the venture without leaving the good and solid earth. So why are they behaving this way? And what the impossible question we are trained never to ask, do the hammer orchids make of it all? For we know and we insist the orchids cannot think or see, or in any way that we will ever admit, no. And they are up there in the trees, clinging, while the male flies and F's with the female down below. Apologies for the boulderization, but I don't know what YouTube's attitude to swearing is. The male and the female wasp do not hurry. No, not at all. This is where the Barry White music comes in. They remain locked together in fornication for hours. So Viagra has made the insect kingdom. And they do other things. Pardon? The female, for the first time in her life, is of the ground, in flight. The tunnel-digging predator now kisses the sky. She does not waste this rare opportunity. The male hauls her from flower to flower, and here they both feed, continuing to F all the while. For the first and last time during her time on this earth, the female tastes nectar. While the male and female wasp are slurping up nectar and fornicating, the male, we think, is also scoping out the forest floor. Sex, we believe, does not distract him from this great task. Well, that's not true. Men don't multitask. This is well known. He is looking for a good place to drop the female later, after the bash, a piece of ground rich in beetles where his kind can thrive, where his descendants will prosper. Just how he does this we do not understand, but we feel confident that, however strange it may seem, he is actually the explorer of his world, the Columbus finding the new country and the new future, and the hammer orchid that cannot watch, watches, and that cannot see, sees, that cannot know. So the implication being somehow the orchid does know. And I'll get into the specifics of why all this is relevant to a world of simulation and why this makes us anxious. But I don't think when Bowden was writing, AI had fully come on the scene, and even more so before him, McLuhan would, could only perhaps sense AI was on its way. But with AI in the world, it just strikes me that this type of the thing that cannot know but actually somehow does is very relevant. So this is when the male wasp on top and then the female wasp hanging below without any wings. This apparently is when the male wasp has brought the female wasp back down to earth with a previous bang, so to speak. So she's being carried back to her food source. Very considerate male wasp. We are in Australia. The wasps are mating just below, and orchids, particularly hammer orchids and elbow orchids, seem to notice. The hammer orchids, for example, have a strange labellum, that tongue-like projection in the middle of the flower. It looks just like a small, fat, wingless female version of the fine-eyed wasp. The imitation is damn near perfect. Shiny head, round, faintly hairy body, ass tilted up a bit into the air. The scent also, that delicious pheromone the female releases, is copied and wafts off into the air from the hammer orchid. It is floating across the forest. It is sexually inviting, perhaps maddening, and the orchid, which cannot possibly know, now it hears the rush of wings approaching it, though of course it cannot possibly hear either. So now we're getting into some close-up. This is the warty hammer orchid. And I will show you throughout this various, I was going to say vulvic images, but vulvic isn't that a type of mineral water? Quickly moving on. So this is, you see the similarity of how the male wasp could be deceived. But again, remember, this is all an extended metaphor, in my view, for a simulated world in which I think Bowden's arguing we're tricked into behaviours or desires that aren't what they seem to be. So he's using this as a metaphor, particularly for a highly technologised world that we live in. And I think that's why he was constantly drawn back to the borderland between Mexico, I think is it the Sonoran Desert, but the southwest of America, where the desert it creates this borderland between Mexico and various states. And I will in future for definite. I'm going to do stuff on the desert because Jacques Ellul wrote a short paper on the desert, and it's interesting whether you're religious or not, but the Old Testament references to the desert and the desert as this existential space. I've mentioned in other videos one of my favourite writers, Samuel Beckett. If you think of Waiting for Godot, the whole of the stage is basically an existential desert with one solitary tree. So the distance, the emptiness, all these aspects of the desert feed into the Western imaginary. The fake female wasp rides on the end of a little hinged arm that sticks up from the flower of the hammer orchid. She bobs up and down in the wind. She looks so alive, and of course there is that scent. The male descends. Ah, the moment is at hand that evolution has been waiting for. The moment that so stimulated that crabby old churchman Charlie Darwin as he battled his illnesses and fears in his dark English study, grabs the female impersonator, wrenches to take off into his mating flight, and then the hammer comes down. Oops, painful. A thing delicately called the column, and on its end are stigma and pollinia. So this is just a visual coming in to make contact. The male wasp is already trying to probe that uplifted ass with his genitals when wham! Any men watching this, wincing and crossing their legs, the hammer hits, and suddenly the male senses this is not a real female, and he departs. It has taken less than a second. And glued to his back are the reproductive cells of the orchid. There are 4 species of hammer orchids. Each attracts a specific species of thynid wasp, and they do this by mimicking a female that spends all of her life tunnelling in the forest floor far below, except, of course, for her few hours of flying, effing, nectar slurping, and fun. So this is the thinine wasp has been well and truly grasped and hammered. So now to go into the Marshall, to draw, hopefully make the links with Marshall McLuhan. So Marshall McLuhan says this in Medium is the Message. All media work us over completely. They are so persuasive in their personal, political, economic, aesthetic, psychological, moral, ethical, and social consequences that they leave no part of us untouched, unaffected, unaltered. The medium is the massage. Any understanding of social and cultural change is impossible without a knowledge of the way media work as environments. So this is where I'm trying to make the link. What Bowden's describing is the way in which the environment of the male wasp has been simulated so that he is tricked and deceived. I think a common misconception, at least according to people like McLuhan, and I agree with him, is the notion, I call it the banana-rama theory of technology. It's not what you've got, it's the way that you use it, and that's what gets results. It's this myth of neutrality. Lots of people think it's not the technology, it's how you use it. That's what matters. And in one of his works, Marshall McLuhan refers to this as the, does he call it the dumb stance of the technological idiot? I think Langdon Winner referred to it as a truism striving to become a bromide, which is a good phrase. That some limited number of theorists who I agree with are much more cynical and negative. They don't think technology is neutral. But what I really want to emphasize in this quote is the way media work as environments. So McLuhan's making the point our whole environment has altered, and he didn't live to see the advent of digital technologies that have taken us into a whole new realm, a whole simulated environment. And you'll see in some of the subsequent McLuhan quotes how hopefully you'll have an appreciation of how this could all cause anxiety, because it's not natural in any shape or form. It is a simulated environment, and yet the deceptively seductive, to use the wasp-like orchid type metaphor, the seductive aspect of digital technologies is the images we see, the environments they create seem so natural. They've inveigled themselves into lots of people's lives until the mobile phone seems a very natural extension of the hand. And I imagine if things carry on as they are, in 1,000 years' time or whatever length of time evolution needs, there'll be people with just huge comedy thumbs, like Kenny Everett used to have, if any British people remember that. Now, from memory, this is the wasp orchid, I think. But you see how increasingly erotically arousing and seductively the representation of the female becomes. So I don't mean to diss the taste of the wasp, the thynid that goes for the hammer wasp, but I'd argue this is a much better looking fake wasp. So I've included the original here because I just wanted the in this particular edition, the book Counterblast. I think McLuhan uses the typography deliberately to make points, so I didn't want to just do it as basic print. So he says, writing turned a spotlight on the high, dim sierras of speech, which is a beautiful phrase, which I think also Charles Bowden tries to do with the high, dim Sierras of the borderland. Writing was the visualization of acoustic space. It lit up the dark. A goose quill put an end to talk, abolished mystery, gave us enclosed space and towns, brought roads, armies, and bureaucracies. It was the basic metaphor with which the cycle of civilization began, the step from the dark into the light of the mind, the hand that filled a paper, built a city. The handwriting is on the celluloid walls of Hollywood. The age of writing is past, which if you've seen the Christopher Nolan Odyssey, see, I couldn't get through a whole video without mentioning him. He's traumatized me. But it actually says at the end, Odysseus says to Penelope, she says, why will all the stories be sung? And he says, because songs are all we'll have to remember those of us who could write. It's actually stated explicitly in Nolan's Odyssey, this idea that writing, the age of writing is past. We must invent a new metaphor, restructure our thoughts and feelings. The new media are not bridges between man and nature. They are nature. So that is the one thing I'm trying to emphasize in all of this. McLuhan, I think, is really insightful point that these technologies of simulation create a whole fake nature, and we then become the horny wasp in this deceitful situation. We have desires and urges that are going in completely the wrong direction. And again, this is a wasp orchid. They are quite beautiful in a weird way. Media effects on new environments as imperceptible as water to a fish. Subliminal for the most part. Freud's censor is the mechanism by which in sensation we protect ourselves from overstimulation. We live in the rear view mirror. So this is bits I've emboldened as imperceptible as water to a fish is a brilliant way of describing how difficult it is to recognise the effects technology are having on us when, according to McLuhan, it has become second nature. So we have to find, I'll talk in a second about people like James Joyce, you have to find ways of being able to reflect upon the situation we're in and to make it more than just subliminal. Freud's censor, that's the notion that, for example, when you're dreaming, Freud's theory of dreaming was that, and I think to some extent it's been proved by neuroscience since, but rather than have very traumatic memories or traumatic emotions coming through your sleeping brain, the censor is what turns those traumatic ideas or thoughts into truly bizarre dreams so that you're not so negatively affected. And he's making the point here, McLuhan, that we have these inbuilt mechanisms that evolution has provided us with to protect ourselves from overstimulation. So that's in our heads, the Freud censor, the notion of some unconscious filter. But what happens when you externalize a lot of our psychological thinking and emotions and all these things are put out there into social media, and people overshare and people are living their lives in this weird external simulated space. We live in the rear view mirror. Media tend to isolate one or another sense from the others. The result is hypnosis. Any medium, by dilating sense to fill the whole field, creates the necessary conditions of hypnosis in that area. This explains why at no time has any culture been aware of the effect of its media on its overall association, not even retrospectively. So it's this difficulty, it's back to the imperceptible as water to a fish. How do you get a grasp upon the effects that technology is having on you if it is this all-encompassing environment that it creates? The youth Narcissus means narcosis or numbing, mistook his own reflection in the water for another person. This extension of himself by mirror numbed his perceptions until he became the servo mechanism of his own extended or repeated image. The nymph Echo tried to win his love with fragments of his own speech, but in vain. He was numb. He had adapted to his extension of himself and had become a closed system. Now, the point of this myth is the fact that men at once become fascinated by any extension of themselves in any material other than themselves. I'm dedicating that quote from Understanding Media to anyone who has teenage kids. And it's been a while since I've used this, but it's my go-to Caravaggio's painting of Narcissus. And you just notice the circularity that is created in the painting, and the naked knee is like the hub of a wheel, but just looking at his own reflection endlessly. And I think Stuart and I discussed this very briefly on the Proust live stream, but the idea in a swipe left, swipe right society, you tend, yes, you're going out with other people, you're not actually going out with yourself, but in a sense you are, because you're picking a type, you're picking in a way that you could never have done in pre-technological times, where the biggest indicator of who you're going to end up with was propinquity, in other words, closeness. You just bump into people, or you work with them, or meet them in the pub. But all of that has been replaced by a much more stratified choosing of mates based upon pre-existing preferences. So there's no... everything just becomes preordained, the simulation, this endless replication of what you already think you like. And there's very little room to grow, to learn, to experiment. Who knows, maybe you could have a different taste if you just tried a different type of person, a different body shape, all these things. But no, the simulation that endlessly replicates itself is based upon your preordained preferences. So you become like the horny wasp being deceived by the hammer orchid stroke Tinder. Environments are not passive wrappings, but active processes which work us over completely, massaging the ratio of the senses and imposing their silent assumptions, which is what I've basically been describing about. Our assumptions about who you might like on Tinder become silent because you don't tend to reflect upon it. You just have, God knows how many dodgy assignations every month with the same type of people endlessly. But environments are invisible. Their ground rules, pervasive structure, and overall patterns elude easy perception. A great example of this would be the almighty algorithm, and how anyone on YouTube spends all their time trying to please this Moloch, this gaping maw that wants ever more topicality and predictability. They are. It's like I've seen brooches, ornate Victorian brooches that look like that, and I don't think it's the best example, but if you think of the bar at the Folie Bergère, the waitress looking at the man enigmatically, and her corsage almost, I think, vaguely looks like that's a red one that mimics the Bass label on the bottle of beer. I'm just freely associating now. This is like the Rorschach R ink blot test. With the arrival of electric technology, man extended or set outside himself a live model of the central nervous system itself. And this is where you go into the concept of anxiety. This is why I believe modern society, the anxious generation, is the way it is. To the degree that is... oh, God, put my teeth back in, apologies. To the degree that this is so, it is a development that suggests a desperate and suicidal auto-amputation. as if the central nervous system could no longer depend on the physical organs to be protective buffers against the slings and arrows of outrageous mechanism. It could well be that the successive mechanizations of the various physical organs since the invention of printing have made too violent and superstimulated a social experience for the central nervous system to endure. So people, especially young people who've grown up in this, are just constantly wired. And ironically, so there's what I'd argue is there's a low level of dopamine-induced anxiety where you're going to get your next fix from. Where's your next message coming from? And then witness the true bone-shattering anxiety if you ever take a mobile phone off a teenager. Any movement of appetite within the labyrinth of cognition is a minotaur which must be slain by the hero artist. Anything which interferes with cognition, whether concupiscence, pride, imprecision, or vagueness, is a minotaur ready to devour beauty. And there's a few things to say here. I will return to the labyrinth. I did, very early on in the channel, I did some work on the labyrinth. But the whole myth of the Minotaur really intrigues me. So that Joyce not only was the one first to reveal the link between the stages of apprehension and the creative process, he was the first to understand how the drama of cognition itself was the key archetype of all human ritual, myth, and legend. And thus he was able to incorporate at every point in his work the body of the past in immediate relation to the slightest current of perception. So this is something I will be pursuing when I am going to look at Joyce's work, Ulysses in particular. But it's prefigured in A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. The way in which Stephen Dedalus spends all of his time wanting to be, the uncreated conscience of his people. He wants to, he's doing exactly what McLuhan is describing here. Joyce not only was the first to reveal the link between the stages of apprehension and the creative process, he was the first to understand how the drama of cognition itself was the key archetype. So I won't spend a lot of time on this because it'll be done in future, but it is, Ulysses, for example, is an interesting case in point because there are various narrative techniques. It wasn't his initial intention, but Joyce, as he got into writing, started experimenting with different narrative forms within the novel. So the main sections all have a different type. It starts off with quite a traditional third-person narrative voice, then stream of consciousness. Then there are a chapter based upon newspaper headlines, and so on and so on. It alters the way, the form in which the writing occurs. And overlaying all of that, as the name of the book implies, Ulysses, he's talking about Leopold Bloom's One Single Day in Dublin, but he also traces these ritualistic, repetitious references back to Homer's time. So he's trying to do both. He's trying to perceive and apprehend all our cognitive experiences, but also link them back to the past. And that's what makes his work just so incredibly complex and rewarding. But to get back to the first paragraph there, any movement of appetite within the labyrinth of cognition is a minotaur which must be slain by the hero artist. So that's the Stephen Dedalus character. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. So anything which interferes with cognition, and the wasp and the hammer orchid, the wasp isn't cognicizing, He's been driven by pheromones. He's been driven by deception. He's not got full cognition of the situation. And hence, I think McLuhan is opposing to that lack of cognition someone who's as self-reflectively artistic as Stephen Dedalus, who's in a way is a representative of Joyce himself. I think all this looking at insects has made me itchy. Struggling to sit still. Throughout previous evolution, we have protected the central nervous system by outering this or that physical organ in tools, housing, clothing, cities. But each outering of individual organs was also an acceleration and intensification of the general environment until the central nervous system did a flip. We turned turtle. The shell went inside, the organs outside. Turtles with soft shells become vicious. That's our present state. So anyone in Florida, I'm guessing, where turtles, or do they have wild turtles in the bayou, Louisiana type places? Please, Americans, tell me in the comments. This idea that turtles with soft shells become vicious. Again, the anxiety of the modern contemporary world. That's our present state. If you've externalized all your emotions, if you don't keep anything within, you become a turtle with a soft shell. Cue widespread social paranoia. The system of the hammer orchid usually fails. We're back to Bowden now. How could it be otherwise? If perfect, all the wasps would mate with fake females, and soon there might be no real wasps to attract. Well, birth rates are going down. The fake females, well, they are just not the real thing. No orchid can compete with a real lusty, thynid female. Not at all. Males will hardly visit the flowers when living females are out and about. The scent is just not like the whiff of the real thing. But there is a saving fact, a tiny detail that makes the sex life of hammer orchids possible. Each spring, it's like spring break, the males show up a couple of weeks before the females, and the hammer orchid knows this. No, that can't be right. These damn things can't really know. During this interlude, the hammer orchid seduces male thynids, and they land, and they F the false female, and the hammer falls. It's been going on for... That's a very dramatic one, isn't it? That's the Kim Kardashian of the hammer orchid world. Michaud Apoyang studied the orchids for 20 years, but he told no one what he suspected, pseudo-copulation. He worried what people would think if he published the fact that insects are effing flowers, beating their meat, as it were, pointlessly. The whole thing smacked of those sex dolls advertised in certain magazines, the inflatable dummies that men buy and fornicate with as a substitute for actual women. He tested and tested and tested. If the labellum, the sexual dummy, were held upside down, the males came near but did not land. If he placed a bunch of the sexual dummies under, say, a newspaper, and the scent, that sexual scent, wafted off, male wasps began to appear and seemed to search for their lovers. But eventually he nailed down the evidence, published it, and now the whole world knows of this. Well, bizarre circumstance, this phony effing, this unseemly thing. Not that anyone seems to pay much notice. It's almost as if the hammer orchids do not exist, and the sexual dummies do not exist. It's as if it were all invisible, a fact, an act, a history that everyone pretends never really happened. So back to this cheeky chappy, but this idea that it never really happened, we act as if it never happened. I think that's not a bad metaphor for how we feel or how we don't reflect upon the environment that simulated technologies have made for us and the various forms of anxiety that creates. So I hope the links I've tried to make, this notion of Bowden, I'll be returning to Bowden in future. Especially, I might do a series called something along the lines of working title, Welcome to the Desert of the Real, because I am particularly interested in this concept of the desert and what it signifies, what it embodies, the existential qualities, the loneliness, the emptiness, all of these things that in some ways it's the last refuge. It's the only part of the world that isn't dominated by all this deceptive simulated technology. And maybe in a weird way we need to create more deserts, genuine deserts of the real, to return to, from the very beginning, Benjamin's quote about immediate reality being an orchid in the land of technology. Maybe we need to create that type of orchid rather than the sexually deceptive hammer orchid and the way it leads us astray or leads horny wasps astray. So I hope you enjoyed that. All the very best. Till the next time. Take care.